Hey everyone! Today's story is about a guy who dies at just 20 years old and gets reincarnated into another world. But due to a mistake by the goddess, he isn't reborn as a hero. He gets reincarnated as Moss. Yeah, actual Moss. So with that said, let's begin the story. The main character is Tendo Hikaru. At the age of 5, he lost his parents in a fire and grew up in an orphanage. And when he finally got a job, he worked from morning till night at a small factory for peanuts. Until one day, he simply collapsed from exhaustion. Right now, he was experiencing the moment of his own death, and the fact that he had even managed to regain consciousness was a true blessing. When he opened his eyes for a few moments, he found himself in a hospital room, a white ceiling, the smell of medicine, a bed from which he could not move a single limb. He thought, then, that if he were ever reborn, he wanted to live carefree and close his eyes. But then a voice made him start, a woman's voice, melodious, seeming to come from nowhere, which stated quite calmly that neither of those things had caused him to regain consciousness. Hikaru opened his eyes and found himself standing in a completely empty space where there was nothing, no walls, no floor, no horizon, only a uniform white light in every direction, and yet he felt perfectly healthy, as if the body that had just failed him had vanished somewhere. He slowly looked around, tried to understand what was happening, and aloud, already beginning to get nervous, asked, where was he? And hadn't he died yet? The voice in his head continued. This was neither God's mercy nor the Reaper's trickery. And then it added that it could see his confusion. Hikaru clasped his head in his hands and looked around again, mentally asking himself where on earth the voice was coming from. Right inside his brain? Noticing his growing panic, the voice said it would explain everything. The next second, a girl appeared before Hikaru. Golden hair, elven ears, a third eye on her forehead, a delicate tiara, a halo behind her head. She held out her hand and introduced herself, Astartina, a goddess from another world who ruled over this realm, and who was currently searching for a soul to reincarnate. She explained that she had been flipping through a book when suddenly a small flame flew in. It landed on one of the pages, leaving a name. Then she chuckled and realized she had found the right person, even if by chance. And now she had come ask him. Hikaru listened and listened, then frowned, pursing his lips. Only one thought formed in his mind. This is a dream. Astartina cried out, starting to get angry. She was explaining that this wasn't a dream, that the chance to be reborn in another world was extremely rare, and he should be grateful to her. And she was practically shouting all this, seeing that her interlocutor wasn't listening to her at all. Hikaru frowned slightly, hesitated, and thanked her. Astartina laughed, and said that was fine now. She cleared her throat, rubbed her chin, and closed her eyes for a second. Then she pointed in front of her, where something like a mirror had appeared, and explained. The world in which he would be reborn was called Valentii, a fantasy world of swords and magic. Since it wouldn't be easy for an earthling there, she would grant him some bonuses as an exception. The right to choose his race and skills. Hikaru looked at her and thought that this goddess was a bit pathetic. Astartina heard this, grumbled that she could hear everything, making him flinch slightly. She continued, saying that she wasn't pathetic at all, but a pure, beautiful, and popular goddess, and that she would now explain the races and skills. Hikaru thought she was just bragging about herself. A chart appeared before him. Draconian, demon, windman, earth folk, beast folk, human. Astartina explained. The higher a race is on the list, the stronger it is, but the fewer skills are available. A draconian, for example, gets only one. The lower down the list, the more skills there are, with one additional skill per tier. That's the balance of power. He'll see which skills are available to him after his rebirth, and take his time choosing. Hikaru stared thoughtfully ahead, mentally weighing his options. The Draconian are the strongest, humans the weakest, but with the right skills, he could compete with anyone. He isn't particularly interested in power, nor does he want to become someone notable or turn into a target. The beast folk do pique his curiosity somewhat. But no, he needed to choose a human, blend in with the crowd, acquire 6 useful skills, and lead a quiet life. That was the only way. The decision was made. He nodded to himself and said aloud, addressing the goddess, that he had made up his mind. He wanted to race from the very bottom of the list. Astartina smiled, and she muttered that she hadn't expected such a choice. She had reincarnated dozens of people already, but Hikaru was the first like this. The protagonist raised his eyebrows slightly and realized that, besides him, there were others who had been reincarnated. The goddess, not noticing his hesitation, said that in that case she would choose the lowest race. And the icon on the tablet began to slowly slide down the list. Hikaru smiled as he watched this. And suddenly, the icon passed a human and kept going. He stared at it in complete shock, started shouting for her to stop. Where on earth was the rest of the list? Meanwhile, the icon calmly skipped past monsters, animals, insects, and plants. and came to a halt on the moss. Hikaru immediately shouted, "Wasn't a human at the very bottom? He hadn't said a word about any moss. How could he possibly be moss?" Astartina raised her eyebrows in surprise and said, completely unperturbed, that he himself had asked for the very bottom. And if he wanted to be a human, he should have said so. A portal was already beginning to form around him, but Hikaru wouldn't calm down and shouted that please, he'd do anything, just let them turn him into a human. Astartina smiled brightly and, just as calmly, informed him that the decision had been made and even she couldn't change it. But moss was the weakest form, so Hikaru would be able to choose as many as 15 skills. He tried to shout something in response, but the next second he was engulfed in light, struck by lightning, and he vanished, leaving only emptiness behind. When he came to, he grumbled. Where was he? He couldn't see anything around him, and immediately snapped himself out of it. Well, that's only natural, after all, he's moss. He cursed the deceitful goddess in his mind, but he immediately forced himself to focus. He could feel the breeze, the presence of water nearby, which meant he needed to figure out the situation. He mentally ordered his status to open. Hikaru looked at it and thought the status was pretty crappy. He was too weak and wouldn't last long. He needed to get the skills from the reborn bonus ASAP. He ordered the panel to open. The selection turned out to be huge. Hikaru perked up. If he chose identification, he could check the effects of all the other skills. He began selecting what seemed most useful. Life detection, detects signs of life nearby. Magic detection, detects magical activity nearby. He immediately put it to use. And he chuckled. It seemed he was growing on a large rock in the middle of a small pond, and the area around him was safe for now. There was no need to panic. He would take his time, choosing the rest of the skills. But first, he tried swiping the status icon, and it worked. He mentally clicked. Just as he'd expected, it scrolled. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He had high hopes for the special evolution skill, which was at the very bottom. Upon reaching the maximum level of his race, the opportunity to evolve into a higher form or another race would open up. He selected the remaining skills as well and surveyed the resulting list with some satisfaction. There was something pleasant about it, looking at it all at once like a small collection. So, the plan is this: evolve, survive, gather skills, and ultimately live a peaceful life. Decided. Now it was time to put it into practice. He cast a light spell. A small flame flickered nearby. Mana regenerates automatically, although it's a shame he can't see it himself. Next, water magic, a water blade, and a few branches in front of him were cut cleanly and neatly. Feeling the skill's feedback, he thought it was really cool and kept going until his level reached 6 and his water magic reached 3. Then he wondered, I wonder if I raise my level even more, will I get 2 blades? Suddenly, something hit him on the head. His appraisal skill had activated. A label appeared before him. F-rank shrimp, level 7, skill, movement in water. Hikaru noted to himself that it was indeed an ordinary shrimp, but higher than him in both rank and level. And noticing that it was starting to crawl out of the water toward him, he decided he had no intention of waiting for guests, and that this one would be perfect as a test subject. He used his water blade, but he missed. He cursed under his breath. He replenished his mana and tried again as the shrimp got closer. This time it worked. Several streams of water sliced it in two, and he mentally exclaimed that he'd finally hit the mark. Feeling what was left of the shrimp next to him, he thought that it should rest in peace. Thanks to that, his level rose to 7, and his water magic to 4. Another week passed. Light magic, water blades, light magic again. He exhaled heavily and thought that another day had been safely survived. 5 shrimp in a day. Level 10, a nice round number. He was humming something to himself when unfamiliar chimes sounded, and an icon appeared before him with a message that level 10 was the maximum, and next to it, the evolution access icon lit up. Hikaru froze for a moment. He had reached the maximum level for Moss. His special evolution skill had activated, and he immediately chose it. A new menu appeared before him with 3 options: weed, medicinal herb, poisonous herb. Hikaru stared at it, and he thought, finally, the next step, he would no longer be Moss. Those were the conditions of the special evolution skill. When a race's level reaches its maximum, the opportunity to evolve into a higher form or another race becomes available. The maximum level for Moss was 10, and the skill had activated, even though Hikaru hadn't really expected it to. So 3 options: weed, medicinal herb, and poisonous herb. First, an assessment. He activated the skill and methodically went through the list. Weed, high vitality, withers with difficulty, not bad. Medicinal herb. He could learn healing skills, but the risk of being hunted down is too great. That's out of the question. Poisonous herb. It's unlikely any animal would deliberately eat a poisonous plant, and people who would come to gather it haven't shown up yet. The choice was obvious. Hikaru mentally asked, let them turn him into a poisonous plant. A flash of bright light. and the moss turned into a small sprout. Hikaru felt that he had grown larger, and the place where he was growing had shifted from a rock to the ground. He briefly thought that maybe it was thanks to the goddess, and immediately he opened the new status screen. It had changed noticeably. His level had reset to 1 again, but the fact that evolution raised the levels of even those skills he couldn't use yet, that helped a lot, and it was all thanks to this special evolution. The protagonist fell into thought. Apparently, he could produce poison, but he wouldn't be able to release it on his own, which meant that to deliver the poison to his opponent, he would have to sacrifice himself, which was tantamount to mutual destruction. He wasn't happy with that idea, and he kept weighing his options, until a scene from the recent past popped into his mind. How he had sliced a shrimp with a water blade. It hit him instantly. He would simply combine the poison with the water blade. He even came up with a name, the Poison Blade. Now that he'd figured it all out, it was time to practice. For the next few days, he trained, forming the spell over and over, missing, losing concentration, trying again. He mentally noted every mistake and thought he had it all figured out. It was pretty difficult, but he wasn't going to give up. After a while, a strange rustling sound rang out, quiet, cautious, very close by. Hikaru instantly focused. Finally, someone had shown up, and it was time to test a technique that had taken him several days to create. He ran a scan. Rabbit, rank F, level 12, skill, jump. Hikaru was taken aback. A rabbit? He didn't quite understand the naming conventions, though that wasn't the point. Level 12 was actually quite high. He froze, sensing the enemy enthusiastically chewing on medicinal herbs nearby, and thought that it was a good thing, after all, that he had evolved into a poisonous one rather than a medicinal one. In the next second, he summoned a few water droplets, and he launched a poisonous blade, directing the stream of water straight at the target. He sensed that the wound was shallow, but that didn't matter. It was enough for the poison to take effect. He froze and assessed the situation again, watching. The poison was working. Then he chuckled, and he noticed that a new title had appeared on the list, Big Game Hunter. Stats increase when fighting an opponent of a higher rank and level. Hikaru muttered thoughtfully to himself, does big game mean a rabbit? Although, if the poison hadn't worked. In any case, next time I need to be more careful and plan my strategy more thoroughly. Ordinary days dragged on. Hikaru kept himself entertained, casting light spells, leveling up. And at some point, he caught himself realizing that life had unexpectedly become routine. He couldn't help but think that maybe it was thanks to that goddess, and immediately snapped himself out of it. No, he was definitely overreacting. At that moment, something stirred nearby. Hikaru cursed inwardly. He'd gotten carried away, casting light spells non-stop and draining his mana to 0. He cast an assessment spell, and what he saw didn't please him. An iguana, rank F, level 15, skills, intimidation and tail strike. Hikaru thought in a panic. Iguanas are herbivores. The lizard slowly looked around several times, and then it moved purposefully straight toward the sprout. Hikaru felt it approaching, step by step, unhurriedly, confidently, and panic began to grow. He was poisonous grass, but what if it simply ate him right now before his mana had recovered? Self-healing wasn't keeping up. There was only one plan left. He cast a light spell at maximum brightness. A large, blinding ball flashed next to the sprout, flooding everything around it with white for a split second. The iguana growled loudly and shook its head from side to side, disoriented, trying to regain its vision. Hikaru mentally exhaled. Great. Everything was going according to plan. Now he just had to stand still and wait for his mana to recharge. He watched the gauge, 4 units per minute. It would take another minute and a half to fire the poisonous blade, and he didn't have a single backup plan left in his head. He really could die. The iguana's gaze gradually cleared. It was recovering faster than he'd expected and began moving slowly toward him again. Hikaru mentally pleaded with every god at once to keep the lizard from reaching him before it was time. And in the next second, he realized it didn't understand that it was facing a sprout capable of using magic. The lizard was looking around, trying to find the source of the flash, and clearly didn't view him as a threat, which meant he was saved, provided he managed to gather enough mana. The bar crept upward slowly. When he had gathered enough, he didn't wait a second. He summoned several blades and attacked. The iguana only managed to let out a loud growl, and in the next moment, it collapsed to the ground. Hikaru mentally noted that this time it had been truly dangerous, and that from now on he must never let his mana run out. Never, under any circumstances. 2 weeks had passed since the victory over the iguana. Things weren't going well. It was too peaceful, his level was stuck at 4 and wouldn't budge, and Hikaru was realizing more and more clearly. If he didn't evolve soon, he'd die of old age before he died at the hands of any enemy. He had already begun to ponder this rather gloomily, when one of his skills suddenly triggered, a signal of a presence nearby. The sensation was completely different. unlike any of the animals he had encountered before. Hikaru concentrated, listening, and realized it was a monster. Something long, with many legs, something resembling a centipede. The monster possessed a strong acid ability, which meant that if it doused him with acid, it would be the end. Hikaru quickly assessed the situation, concluding that he had a chance of winning only under one condition. The monster must not discover his location. But if he managed to defeat it, his chances of evolving would be very high, so there was no time to waste. Without giving himself time to doubt, he wielded the poison blade and struck the monster in the back. The enormous centipede reared up and began darting wildly in all directions with a deafening roar, spewing a large cloud of acid forward, which hissed as it hit the ground right nearby, scorching the grass and leaving behind smoking furrows right at the base of the sprout. It hadn't hit the sprout itself, and Hikaru breathed a mental sigh of relief. The next second, he noticed the centipede's gaze, all of its numerous compound eyes, suddenly dart to the side. It had spotted the glowing orb he had created in advance a short distance away, anticipating exactly this turn of events. And it took the bait. While it was looking at the false target, its back was exposed, and Hikaru, smiling inwardly, concentrated, gathering his mana into several sharp streams. And he released the poisonous blades again. These struck their mark precisely and cut the centipede in half. It let out a furious, choking scream, and fell silent forever. Hikaru froze, feeling the tension gradually ease, and came to a conclusion that was already beginning to feel like a rule to him. If you act cautiously and don't lose your head, everything works out. The next second, the evolution icon lit up before him. His level had finally risen enough, and he eagerly opened the panel. Then he grunted, lowered the leaves, and thought that his premonition hadn't deceived him. The choices were so-so: sleep-inducing grass, poisonous grass, paralyzing grass, disorienting grass. He thoughtfully considered each option, acknowledging that they were all useful in their own way. But he had already chosen his path and had no intention of straying from it to master poisons, period. Waving the leaves, he mentally commanded that he wanted to become a deadly poisonous herb. 5 days passed, and the whole time went surprisingly smoothly. Too smoothly, as it turned out a little later. Because by the time Hikaru finally noticed that there was more than one enemy nearby, it was already too late. He was surrounded. The small hollow where he grew turned out to be literally littered with green worms. They appeared from all sides. The insects were rank F, level 20, with a special skill, sticky thread. Hikaru cursed inwardly and realized that he'd gotten too caught up in leveling up, simply forgotten about detection, and let his guard down at the worst possible moment. And here was the result. He quickly scanned the area using his skill. There were many worms, too many, and although individually each of them was weaker than the acid centipede he had already dealt with, he wouldn't be able to handle such a large number head-on. That much was obvious. And if he didn't come up with something right now, they'd simply eat him, and that would be the end of it. He used his poisonous blade. One of the worms split in half and fell, and Hikaru mentally cheered that he'd killed it with a single strike. But the joy lasted exactly 1 second because the rest didn't back down, but only closed the ring tighter. His mana was regenerating at a catastrophically slow rate, and panic was the only thing swirling in his head. Until, in the next second, a sharp pain pierced him through and through. One of the worms sank its fangs into the leaf and bit off a piece, and it felt as if something alive and hot had been torn right out of him. The pain spread throughout the entire sprout instantly, sharp and absolutely real. Hikaru froze in surprise, because he had never seriously considered that plants could feel pain, and now he knew for sure, and a childhood memory of plucking daisy petals at the orphanage popped into his head at the worst possible moment. And he silently asked them for forgiveness. The worm that had bitten off a piece rose and collapsed dead. The deadly poison worked instantly. The other worms recoiled, emitting sharp, chaotic sounds, hesitant to approach. They didn't understand what had happened, but sensed something was wrong, and Hikaru noticed this, instantly realizing, while they hesitated, this was his chance. The damaged leaf was already beginning to regenerate at the edges. Mana was slowly returning, and if he seized the moment right now, he could pull through. He began to strike. Poisonous blades flew in all directions, one after another, in short, precise bursts, not giving the worms a chance to react. The first few fell almost immediately, sliced in half before they could react. The rest began to turn around, trying to locate the source of the attack, shooting sticky threads in all directions. One of them passed very close by and stuck to the ground just centimeters from the sprout. Hikaru came to when the count had passed 30, thinking that somehow he had survived after all. By then, the pain had almost gone, his level had risen noticeably, and a new skill had appeared on his list: pain resistance. He glanced at the bodies around him. There were unexpectedly many of them, and decided to put them in storage just in case. You never know, they might come in handy. After that, he waved the leaves and thought that it hadn't been for nothing that they'd gnawed on him so thoroughly. Now he must be a little harder to kill. A week had passed since Hikaru defeated the greenworms, and his skill growth had slowed noticeably. You can't achieve much through solo training alone. Although, to tell the truth, there was nothing else to do but keep at it. He was just thinking about this when a loud rumble came from deep within the forest, followed by strange, terrifying sounds that seemed to make the ground tremble. Hikaru snapped to attention and used his assessment skill, discovering that two creatures were locked in battle. A giant mantis, rank F, level 32, and a stone scorpion, rank F, level 31. Both growling menacingly and clearly not about to give an inch. He watched them, the spotted leaves swaying slightly, and he thought that these were nothing like the mantises and scorpions he knew from his homeworld. These were nearly 2 meters long, massive, covered in chitin the color of scorched stone, and every movement they made shook the undergrowth around them. They were steadily closing in on him, crushing bushes and snapping branches, and Hikaru realized clearly, if their battle reached him, unable to move from the spot, he was simply finished. The mantis struck first, lashing out with its scythe like front legs and slashing the scorpion's carapace along its side. The scorpion recoiled, whipping its stinger-tipped tail, and struck back, aiming for the joint between its opponent's head and thorax. But the mantis dodged with a lightness unexpected for its size and attacked again, pinning the scorpion to the ground. Hikaru watched this and realized that, given the situation, the mantis would win. But if the fight between them reached him first, that wouldn't save him. He had to act immediately. He concentrated and released a poisonous blade, severing one of the mantis's legs. A deafening roar of pain rang out, and the mantis staggered. And the scorpion instantly seized the opportunity, delivering a series of crushing blows with its tail to the enemy's exposed side, piercing the chitin right through. The scorpion withdrew its stinger. But in that very instant, it too was sliced in half by the poisonous blade, and the scorpion fell with a scream. Hikaru exhaled heavily, waved his leaves, and thought that somehow he had managed to take care of both of them after all. That's what it means to skillfully take advantage of someone else's fight. A small chime rang out, and he realized, since his opponents were higher in rank, he had gained an unexpectedly large amount of experience, and from 2 at once. So evolution was available again. Hikaru read all of this, and thought that the title sounded a bit grim, but it would definitely come in handy for survival. And then, with curiosity, he studied the evolution chart. Venu flytrap, sarasunya, nipantes. He asked himself, what on earth were these? The names alone made no sense at all, so he used his judgment. The Venus flytrap turned out to be a plant with rounded trap-like petals, lined with long teeth along the edges that snapped shut around its prey. Sarracenia was a tall, tubular funnel with a hood on top, inside which digestive fluid glistened. Nepenthes was a plant with a long pitcher on slender stalks, filled with sweet nectar in which any unwary creature would drown. All three turned out to be carnivorous, and Hikaru thought with unexpected excitement that now he would be able to eat the insects he had been defeating up until now. And he wondered just how big would he grow if he started eating for real. Still, he couldn't help but evolve, so all that was left was to choose the one with the cooler name. He announced that he was choosing the Nepenthes. A small sprout was bathed in bright light, and in its place appeared a huge pitcher-shaped plant, about 5 meters tall with broad, glossy leaves and a pitcher filled with a shimmering liquid that had a faintly sweet scent. Hikaru noted to himself that it seemed an elderly neighbor had grown something similar in a pot on the windowsill. But what he had become now was something entirely different. It was more of a plant monster than just a plant. And then it dawned on him, for the first time, he could control his own body. He had 2 small antennae with which he could pick up and move small objects, and he happily wiggled them from side to side. He figured his strength was still limited, but this was already a huge step forward. Soon something stirred on the rim of the pitcher. A rat, drawn by the scent of nectar, appeared at the edge, twitched its wet nose, and squeaked, and jumped inside, dissolving into the liquid before it had a chance to realize what was happening. Hikaru thought that his nectar clearly attracted creatures on its own, and at this rate, he would easily level up, and mentally wished that everything would go smoothly this time. After a while, he twitched his whiskers in annoyance. Standing before him was a massive D-rank bear, who was calmly shooing away the smaller monsters that had flocked to the scent of nectar from the jug, and was simply taking his prey. He had to do something immediately. Using his special skill, Hikaru quickly analyzed the situation around him. A large toad with crown-like growths on its head was pacing near the bear, and a massive spider, both, apparently, also drawn by its scent. The next second, the bear swung its paw wide, and with one sharp movement, it swept the small monsters aside, clearing a space for itself. And Hikaru realized this was his chance. While the bear was distracted and standing sideways, he had to aim precisely avoiding the tough hide on its body and strike at a vulnerable spot. He concentrated, waited for the right moment, and drove the blade straight into the bear's eye. A deafening roar rang out, and blood gushed from the eye socket. However, the bear didn't fall. Instead, it spun around and moved purposefully toward Hikaru. The protagonist panicked as he thought. He had managed to inject the deadly poison, but the only question was which would work faster, the poison or the bear's paw. The bear swung its paw wide, preparing to strike. And Hikaru, cursing inwardly, threw the vine aside and grabbed the bear's lower paw. He yanked sharply. The bear lost its balance and crashed heavily to the ground, shaking everything around it. While the bear tried to get up, scraping its claws against the ground and growling with mounting fury, Hikaru wrapped the vine tighter around it, preventing it from standing, and didn't let go until the poison had done its work. The bear twitched one last time, heavier and slower with each movement. Blood from its gouged out eye spread in a dark stain across the ground. Its massive body went limp and stiffened, and silence fell. Hikaru released the vine and mentally declared that this was his victory. Although the situation was frightening, that much was certain. He looked ahead and found that a whole line of creatures had formed in front of him, patiently waiting for a chance to dive into the jug and dissolve into the juice. He watched this and wondered just how potent his nectar had become, and then something hit the jug hard from the outside. An ogre, who clearly didn't want to wait in line, was shaking it from side to side. Hikaru groaned inwardly and asked into the void, how long was this going to go on? A week later, Hikaru successfully maxed out his level, and the evolution panel appeared before him once again. This time there were 3 options: Mandrake, Alron, and Miasma. He weighed his options and studied each one thoughtfully. Mandrake, a human-like root creature with a tuft of leaves instead of hair, whose scream instills fear and sows madness in anyone who hears it. Alron, a massive flower on a sturdy stem with a wide, open mouth capable of swallowing whole anyone who carelessly approaches. Miasma, a squat, slime-covered stump on tentacle-like roots that moves about and spits out various poisons produced right inside its body. Hikaru thoughtfully rubbed one of his whiskers and almost cautiously thought that all 3 options were truly dangerous this time, perhaps the most difficult choice he'd ever faced. At the other end of the forest, while he was still deliberating, a battle was unfolding. The adventurer Eric was fending off forest wolves side by side with his partner Thomas, who shouted over to him, "Are you okay?" But he immediately doubted his own question in his mind, because Thomas was barely defending himself. A little to the side, 2 girls, Helena, an adventurer healer, was on her knees, covered in blood, breathing heavily and clutching her staff tightly, shielding her friend Mary, an adventurer mage, who lay unconscious. Helena muttered quietly that she had run out of mana, but she couldn't abandon Mary, so she gripped her staff tighter, ordered herself to pull it together, and summoned a fireball, directing it toward the wolves. They were an F-rank group, adventurers who had taken on a routine quest to exterminate green worms, but never found them, and without realizing it, had wandered deeper into the forest than usual. Eric cursed, looking around. Thomas clenched his teeth and shouted into the void. Was this it? Was his life really going to end right here and now? Meanwhile, the wolves continued to close in, growling menacingly. And suddenly they sensed something and, as one, turned their heads toward the depths of the forest. A large stump, covered in strange slime, slowly emerged from behind the tree trunks. It was Hikaru. He had chosen the miasma and now, at the first level of rank B, was slowly shuffling his roots across the ground, thinking that the wolves had spotted him surprisingly quickly. That's what wild instincts are for, and that he felt uneasy about leaving people in trouble, so he stepped forward. Upon seeing him, the wolves turned and fled in panic, and rushed back into the thicket. Thomas watched them go in surprise and muttered that forest wolves just run away. Helena sighed heavily and nodded. No wonder. The miasma was a high-ranking monster, and what on earth was she doing in a place like this anyway? However, almost immediately all 4 began to feel nauseous and dizzy. The poisonous fumes that Hikaru exuded simply by his very presence were spreading through the air like an invisible cloud. Thomas muttered weakly that this meant it was the end. Helena, standing slightly behind them and covering her mouth with her hand, said with a heavy sigh that dying from stinky breath was definitely worse than dying from forest wolves, and she dropped her head heavily, furrowing her brow. Hikaru heard all. He stopped, ceased moving his roots, and froze in place, thinking was he really that bad? That the people he had just saved were looking at him with weapons at the ready and clearly ready to flee. He had met people for the first time in a long time, and it turned out they weren't happy to see him at all. After thinking for a second, the miasma turned around and quickly strode back into the forest, shuffling her roots. Thomas thrust his spear heavily into the ground, and he watched the receding creature, asking aloud, what on earth was that? Eric, standing next to him, sighed heavily and frowned slightly, but said nothing. A little later, the four of them made it out to the road, and Mary came to her senses. And Hikaru decided to follow them, cautiously peeking out from behind tree trunks. Even though there were animal carcasses everywhere around him, the people were walking confidently in a certain direction, and he thought, so it wasn't a mistake to follow the adventurers after all. Judging by the direction, if I keep heading south, there should be a settlement, but in my current state, I can't make it there. Plus, the local monsters have stopped giving decent experience. My level barely went up. So, maybe it's worth heading north into the mountains, where there are sure to be stronger enemies. Though a strange feeling that the enemies around him were getting weaker and weaker wouldn't leave him. After a while, he was already in the mountains. As soon as he stepped out into the open, a wyvern appeared in the sky. Level 46, rank B. Hikaru recoiled in fear and screamed inwardly. Then, pulling himself together, he continued. Well, he'd found an opponent pretty quickly, and that was certainly good, but if it attacked from the air, there wasn't much he could do about it. He summoned a small water orb and watched the dragon closely as it circled high above. The dragon opened its mouth and began gathering energy for a volley. Hikaru noticed this movement, and he mentally exclaimed, "Here it comes," after which he cast the water bullet spell. And at the last second, he deflected the fireball. A huge cloud of hot steam billowed up from the collision of the two elements. The protagonist mentally exhaled, thinking that if he had been even a moment late, nothing but ashes would have remained of him. And then he froze thoughtfully and asked into the void, what should he do now? Suddenly, something was felt in the air, and the wyvern, it seemed, felt the same thing. The dragon shot upward and flew away. Hikaru remained standing in the middle of the open clearing. Then he stumbled and mentally shouted after it, that no one who went against him would manage to escape. The next second, a red dragon named Vola, rank A, level 83, landed right in front of him. The impact sent cracks radiating in all directions, and dust billowed up. And Hikaru thought to himself, this is bad, bad, very bad, and then asked himself, where on earth did such a monster come from? The dragon slowly lowered itself onto all four paws and stared intently at a small stump in front of it, not moving an inch. Hikaru froze in confusion, frantically trying to figure it out. Why wasn't the monster doing anything? Maybe it wasn't going to attack at all? And in the next second, he got his answer. The dragon opened its mouth, and a fireball began to flare up between its teeth. Hikaru mentally exclaimed that this couldn't be happening and fired water bullets, using up all his remaining mana, and barely managed to parry the blow. After that, he froze in place, pale, if you can say that about a stump, and realized quite clearly. If he seriously clashed with this monster, he would die. There was no question about it. He had to retreat, slowly, cautiously, so as not to provoke an attack. He took a few small, cautious steps backward, holding his breath and watching the dragon's reaction. It remained motionless. Hikaru wondered, was it really not going to chase him? Had he really escaped? And he kept backing away until the trees hid him from the view of those huge, unblinking eyes. For the next 2 weeks, he worked hard to level up, staying far away from the mountains. And finally, he reached level 50. It was time to evolve. The sign with the options turned out to be much more appealing than usual this time. A hornet, swift, with powerful jaws and a stinger capable of piercing thin armor. An ant, small, but with monstrous strength for its size and a highly developed team instinct. A worm, a spider, a long, many-legged creature weaving sticky hunting webs. A mantis, with lightning facile-like legs and nearly invisible camouflage. Scorpion, armored, with a venomous tail and heavy pincers. And finally, the rhinoceros. Beetle, massive, with an imposing horn on its head and a shell capable of withstanding a serious blow. Hikaru thought that finally, insects, the next step, he would cease to be a plant, though his rank would temporarily drop, but that wasn't so important. He froze for a second in silence, weighing his options, then grunted and decided that this time he would let his intuition choose for him. And his intuition was pointing unequivocally toward the beetles. The next second, his body was flooded with light, and in place of the large stump stood a beetle. Hikaru noted with satisfaction that its form was simple and beautiful, and its silver shell was simply magnificent, and immediately caught himself. Silver? Where did the silver come from? After that, he realized with some surprise that he was a mutant. Looking over the list of new abilities, he discovered flight, enhanced physical attributes, and, unexpectedly, a thirst for killing, which left him slightly taken aback. Looking around carefully, he noticed clearly hostile creatures all around him. He cursed inwardly and thought that this was still the northern side of the forest. He should have evolved on the southern side, where the monsters were weaker. Flapping his wings, he easily rose into the air and, flying above the treetops, thought that as soon as he landed in a safe place, he would need to urgently work on his level. Meanwhile, On the other side of the forest, an acid centipede had already raised its claws above a green worm. But it didn't get a chance to do anything. Hikaru, flying past, cast a shining arrow spell and prevented the attack. He noted to himself that bugs are naturally geared toward physical attacks, but magic is still more convenient. Then he glanced at the monster's remains on the ground and wondered, why don't these worms evolve at all? It would seem they should have turned into butterflies or moths long ago, but he had never seen that happen. Although, maybe evolution is only possible if you have the special evolution skill. Landing heavily, he took a few steps forward and chuckled to himself. Thanks to these green worms, his leveling was in full swing. And suddenly he noticed something interesting among them. Could this one be an acid mutant? If so, he'd get a lot of experience from it. He flew closer and fired a glowing arrow. And at that moment, his sixth sense pricked him so sharply that he screamed furiously in his mind, wondering what it was. Parasitic wasps, rank C, level 28, they were already nearby. And he cried out in panic that this was very bad, because if he got stung twice, anaphylactic shock the end, he'd been stung by a hornet back in 3rd grade, and he remembered it perfectly well. Furiously flapping his wings, he rushed away. On the run, he fired water bullets one after another, trying to widen the gap. But the wasps were inexorably closing the distance, and one of them finally attacked him through his armor. And the stinger simply slipped off, leaving not a scratch. For a few seconds, both the beetle and the wasp froze. Hikaru processed what had happened, and, with growing relief, realized that they couldn't pierce his shell at all, not even the slightest scratch, which in itself was brilliant news. The wasps, apparently, didn't understand what was happening either, and while they were trying to figure out the situation, he noticed something else. A black beetle was circling nearby, one that had clearly damaged their nest, and was now brazenly sucking nectar, paying no attention to anyone. Hikaru landed right in front of the insolent beetle and, without a word, charged at it, hooking it with his large horn, and mentally declared that if this one didn't even think to apologize, he certainly wouldn't forgive it. They locked horns, pressing against each other, and Hikaru noted that the advantage in position was on his side. After that, he directed all his strength forward, and with a loud roar, he knocked his opponent onto his back. Without wasting a second, he fired a water bullet, and the black beetle, growling, remained lying on the ground. Hikaru noted to himself that this was a real rush of adrenaline, and immediately noticed a new title, Killer of his own kind, with a bonus to stats when fighting members of his own species. He thought he hoped to use this as rarely as possible. Although, to be honest, looking at everything that's happened to him so far, was he really that combative to begin with? Or is this just something he has to accept in order to survive in this world? In that same battle, he reached the level cap, and the evolution chart appeared again. Soldier beetle, armored beetle, magic beetle. Hikaru thoughtfully rubbed his horn with a leg and realized that since transforming into a beetle, his physical attacks had improved noticeably, but magic was still closer to his heart, so this time he had to choose wisely. And most importantly, he had to do it in a safe place. Hikaru flapped his wings and pressed his paws to his mouth. It was the first time he'd seen a type specializing in magic, and he was genuinely happy about it. Now he was a magical mutant beetle, rank D. Flapping his wings a few times, he easily rose into the air and thought that maybe Mr. Greenworm would help him gain experience quickly. And while he was at it, he wanted to try out his new magic. After flying a few meters, he spotted just the right monster and, without hesitation, cast 2 spells at once. An air cutter, similar to a water blade, but invisible, which gave him a nice advantage. And Stone Needle, which wasn't very powerful, but you could create as many stones as you wanted, so it was perfect for mass destruction. The beetle hovered for a few seconds and chuckled to himself. After all, this was his first time using wind and earth magic. It was interesting, and he'd have to adapt his use of it to the situation. Upon landing, he saw the sign in front of him again and was surprised. His level had gone up, even though he hadn't really defeated anyone yet. Intrigued, he flapped his wings again and circled the clearing, looking for whoever could have given him so much experience from a single spell, but found nothing. Then something in a tree caught his attention, and he finally realized, a perfect stick wielder, rank B, level 40 skill camouflage. Hikaru stared intently and tilted his horn slightly. The monster's camouflage skill was so high that he couldn't even notice it with a casual glance, and that was precisely why his level had risen simply from casting the spell nearby. In that case, he needed to spread miasma around. For a few seconds, everything around him was plunged into thick darkness, viscous, almost tangible, saturated with poison. When Hikaru came to his senses, he froze in confusion and used his assessment skill, and he saw that he had killed a great many things at once. He stood motionless and thought, what had he done? Such power must not be used unless absolutely necessary. It is too much, and he promised himself that from now on, the miasma would remain his last resort. Rising into the air, he looked down. Surrounded by dozens of meters in the middle of the living forest lay a gaping, dead, empty expanse. Not a single patch of green, only blackened earth and motionless trunks. After that, he methodically hunted in the area, wolves, snakes, various worms, until the level began to rise more and more slowly. And then it became clear. He needed to head for the northern mountains. This thought was accompanied by an unpleasant memory of the red dragon, and Hikaru thought that if it appeared again, then he needed a strategy to lure out just the wyvern first and not face something insurmountable right away. After a while, he reached the northern mountains. The wyvern was flying high, growling to itself. And suddenly, it was as if a light bulb went off. It whipped its head around and darted straight toward the source of the strange presence. Hikaru, sitting in a tree, nodded to himself and thought that this was perfect. The monster had spotted him, so now it was time to act. The wyvern was charging straight at him with a deafening roar, flying low over the treetops. And he felt the blood rush to his head in anticipation of the battle. And in the next second, he fired a poisoned shot. He soared forward and thrust his horn out, aiming straight for the monster's head. The blow landed squarely. The wyvern crashed to the ground from the impact and the spell simultaneously, raising a cloud of dust and splinters, and could only shudder, unable to take to the air. Hikaru didn't give a moment's respite. A stone needle, an air cutter, another stone needle, strike after strike without stopping until the wyvern fell silent for good, covered in blood, sprawled among the broken branches. He thought everything had gone smoothly, and if he kept this up, everything would be wonderful. He hunted for 3 more days straight, but his level began to rise with noticeable difficulty. And during one of his sorties, as he flew past, he spotted a dark green wyvern, clearly a mutant. It was obvious at first glance. Hikaru hesitated for a second. Should he run or give it a try? But before he could make a decision, the monster had already detected his presence. With a loud roar, it lunged toward the beetle. Hikaru darted away, thinking on the fly. Could this thing really have life detection? But since he had it too, he knew what to do. He cast the poison field 3 times in a row, covering the wyvern with a wide cone of attack. It crashed down with a roar, smashing through several trees and sending up a cloud of leaves and twigs. Hikaru thought, now that it's on the ground, it's time to attack. However, the wyvern didn't lose its composure, and before it even had a chance to get back up, began exhaling something invisible that spread out in a wave toward him. He cursed, darted sharply to the side, and realized it was elemental magic, an invisible gust of wind, and dodging it was far harder than dodging ordinary fire. He carefully kept his distance, watching the creature's movements, and in the brief pause between her breaths, he fired a glowing arrow. The beam struck the wing squarely, splitting it in 2. The wyvern roared so loudly that the branches around it shook. It tried to rise, and couldn't. Hikaru didn't pause for a second. A water bullet, a poisonous blade, a stone needle, a shining arrow. He unleashed one spell after another, not giving it a moment to counterattack, until the wyvern finally fell silent, sprawled out among the fallen tree trunks. Hikaru dropped to the ground next to the dead body and thought that it had been dangerous, and if it had relied on physical attacks instead of magic, he might well have lost. His level had jumped up 3 at once, which was nice, but there didn't seem to be any more mutants in the northern mountains, and he began to think it was time to move on to another place. Especially since, in his current form, he wouldn't be able to blend into human society and live a peaceful life no matter how much he wanted to. He needed to keep evolving. Exactly 100 days had passed since his rebirth, and Hikaru left his native forest. He had left his homeland. No, the place of his rebirth, a week ago, and was now in the village of Myra in the southwest. He was perched on a tree, disguised as an ordinary beetle, listening thoughtfully to the conversations below, reflecting on the fact that it was he who had exterminated the forest wolves that had been ravaging the local area, and, noticing some commotion nearby, flew a little closer and decided to take his time gathering as much information as possible. Suddenly, something caught his attention, and he recognized them immediately. Those very adventurers he had saved back then in the guise of a miasma. Eric, clearly the leader of their group, thoughtfully rubbed his chin and told the village elder standing nearby that there were no forest wolves to be seen. The elder shook his head and said with annoyance that the adventurers had specifically taken on the quest and come here for the sake of this mission. Hikaru, sitting on a branch a little to the side, felt slightly embarrassed and thought he'd like to apologize to them. After all, he was the one who had killed them. Thanks to the overheard conversation, a picture of the world began to take shape. The northernmost edge of the global continent was the kingdom of Veldarin. To the west of the village of Myra lay the city of Weeble, and to the south, a city called Morris. A boyish voice snapped him out of his thoughts, for children were already standing near the tree, and a black-haired boy in glasses, pointing his finger in his direction, exclaimed that there was something up in the tree. A fair-haired boy next to him raised a stick and declared authoritatively that it was indeed a rhinoceros beetle. Hikaru grew wary. It seemed he had gotten too close to the village, and watched the children with curiosity. They had come exploring all by themselves, without any adults, as if monsters didn't scare them at all. A fair-haired girl in the group anxiously urged everyone to turn back, because a beetle that huge was truly strange. But the fair-haired boy just looked around carelessly and said that everything would be fine, that no matter what happened, he would protect everyone, and that a giant rhinoceros beetle was incredibly cool. Hikaru smiled to himself. He knew exactly how they felt. The black-haired boy in glasses announced matter-of-factly that next time they would definitely bring a net. Hikaru watched them with a quiet inner smile, thinking that he wouldn't want the adults in the village to find out about his existence. Though, if it came down to it, he would simply run away. Today was a good day, and he silently thanked everyone present for the valuable information. Suddenly, a strange premonition came over him. Something was clearly happening. Something was wrong. He turned around and saw the children turn and wander off somewhere, as if spellbound. An illusory butterfly was flying in front of them. Rank E, level 22. Quite beautiful, with iridescent wings. Hikaru pretended not to notice, but inside he was panicking, never having expected such a monster to be nearby. And the kids were so fascinated by it, this was bad. He used his life detection skill, and just as he'd suspected, where the butterfly was flying, a stronger monster was lurking. A poisonous spider, rank E+, level 31, quite large. Hikaru put it all together. The butterfly was one of those that lures prey to a powerful monster and then finishes off the leftovers. He couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. He flapped his wings, rose into the air, and, trying to stay as inconspicuous as possible, followed the children, observing the situation from a distance. The butterfly continued moving forward, and the children followed it. And Hikaru saw them getting closer and closer to a large web stretched between the trees, almost invisible in the shade of the canopy, thick and sticky. There was no time to waste. The beetle lunged forward and impaled the butterfly right through its body with its horn. The next second, it fell right onto the web next to the spider. Spotting its prey, the spider instantly lunged at it. And Hikaru, hovering to the side and watching this, mentally noted that the monster's intelligence was clearly low. It was devouring its own symbiotic partner. Then he turned to the children. All four were already asleep, lulled by the butterfly's effect, which meant he could act without hesitation. The next second, he used the air cutter. An invisible blade sliced clean through the spider. It let out a loud scream and froze on the web, no longer moving. Hikaru buzzed and flew over to a nearby tree, watching the children closely. After a while, they began to come to their senses. The fair-haired boy tried to open his eyes, not immediately realizing where he was. Then he jumped up suddenly and, in a panic, started asking where they were. The dark-haired girl screamed that there was a dead monster right next to them. The fair-haired girl asked in confusion, "Did that butterfly really lead us all straight to our doom?" And both girls immediately rushed to hug each other, comforting one another. The blonde-haired boy stared thoughtfully at the torn-apart spider and couldn't for the life of him understand why they were even alive. Just then, a black-haired boy in glasses approached him, adjusted his lenses, and said matter-of-factly that it was most likely the work of that silver rhinoceros beetle. It couldn't have been anyone else. After all, no one else had seen the butterfly. The children began discussing it all at once, while Hikaru watched them from his branch and thought that they were genuinely surprised, though it made perfect sense. The fair-haired boy picked up one of the spider's legs and authoritatively declared that since it was here anyway, they should take the legs with them. They could sell them and make some money. The fair-haired girl rubbed her chin and agreed that, in principle, he was right. Hikaru fluttered his wings slightly and mentally exclaimed, "No, no, these children need to run back to the village to their parents immediately." They returned and were met by their worried parents, who hugged them tightly and comforted them. A little later, Eric said that since the forest wolves had been killed and there were no other monsters in sight, he was going to return to Weeble. The village elder noticed that there were indeed noticeably fewer monsters around the village. The children had returned unharmed, though they mentioned something about a rhinoceros beetle, and nodded to himself. If the monsters appeared again, he would definitely file a request. Hikaru watched all this from his perch in a tree and thought he'd like to apologize. He was the one who'd killed them all. But at the same time, he realized that he, too, needed to start leveling up again, which meant it was time to follow the adventurers to a new city. The adventurers walked along the road at their own pace, while the beetle flew somewhere nearby, silently destroying every wolf and monster that came within range. Thomas remarked to Mary as they walked that it was strange. They weren't encountering any monsters along the way. Suddenly, Eric stopped. They were standing on a small hill, and he said with a broad smile that he could finally see it. His city, Weeble. Hikaru flapped his wings even harder and flew forward, mentally thanking Eric for everything. Even if it was a one-sided friendship, he still considered them his own. Flying over the rooftops and watching people on the streets chatting with one another, scurrying between stalls, and stopping to chat by the wells, he thought that this was truly a huge city. The stone wall surrounding it, it seemed, had also been created with magic, and that was interesting. Hovering in place, he looked around carefully. To the north, he could see a forest and a cave. Guards stood everywhere along the streets. And the conversations of the townspeople below painted a curious picture. Someone advised stocking up on gear from a specific merchant before taking a labyrinth. Someone warned a companion to stay away from local merchants who prey on adventurers, while others spoke of the powerful monsters on the lower levels. Hikaru waved his horn, and he realized that everything was clear now. It was this very cave that had given rise to such a vast city around it. It was this very cave that adventurers from all directions were drawn to, and that was precisely why there were guards stationed at its entrance. A dungeon was exactly what he needed. There, he would be able to level up effectively. Flying away from the cave, he returned to the city, lazily cutting through the warm city air with his wings, which smelled of smoke and bread, and pondering the best way to sneak inside unnoticed. One of the guards watched the beetle fly past and muttered under his breath that this specimen was unusually huge. The opportunity presented itself. A fight broke out right at the cave's entrance. Two adventurers were settling their differences. One was shouting that the others had stolen his loot, while they pretended they had no idea what he was talking about. The first wouldn't let up and demanded they stop playing dumb, because his group had fought a giant bat on the 5th floor, and they were the ones who deserved this trophy. Onlookers watched with undisguised interest, whispering to each other and egging on both sides, clearly hoping for more. One of the guards shouted that fighting was prohibited here. Hikaru realized there wouldn't be a better moment, and quickly flapped his wings, flying into the cave with a quiet, businesslike buzz while all attention was firmly fixed on the commotion outside. The second guard turned at the sound, but didn't have time to make out anything in the semi-darkness at the entrance, and muttered something indistinctly under his breath. Inside, Hikaru abruptly folded his wings and crouched on one of the stone ledges along the wall, causing several small stones to fall, clattering loudly against the stone floor. He looked around. Ahead, 3 adventurers continued to explore the cave, paying him no mind. Hikaru thought that he was now a monster too, which meant he was technically a target for extermination, and he needed to keep a low profile. Suddenly, a sharp snort sounded right nearby. The lizard sitting on the neighboring ledge, which until that moment had been completely motionless, as if part of the rock, had clearly decided that the beetle would make a fine meal, and it lunged at him, snapping its jaws in the air. Hikaru shot upward instantly and fired a water bullet. The lizard managed only a short death rattle before going still, sliding down and thudding against the rocks. He landed back on the ledge and noted to himself that there were no particular problems on the upper floors. But if he went down further, he would surely find worthy opponents, and that was a far more interesting prospect. He hummed softly, swaying his horns slightly in time with some inner thoughts, and mentally exclaimed, "Long live this dungeon, he would only grow stronger." Meanwhile, somewhere ahead, and much lower down, Eric and his group had stopped, pressed against the rock and breathing heavily. Eric cursed and said they'd gotten too carried away, quietly pursuing the C-rank group, and hadn't noticed how deep they'd gone. Helena, gripping her staff tightly with both hands until her knuckles turned white, asked anxiously, "Where on earth did they go?" Thomas whistled and said that a high-rank group wouldn't even bother with the local monsters, and the corpses were quickly swallowed up by the labyrinth. Mary, frowning slightly and gripping her staff tighter, asked, "Is it so bad if we take these corpses for ourselves?" Eric began to beat himself up, frowning and pursing his lips. If he had insisted back then and stopped everyone in time, they wouldn't be here now. They were gathering materials from monsters that other people had killed, since this place is full of valuable materials that they themselves could never obtain now. It was precisely because of these rich spoils that they got carried away and lost sight of the group ahead. Stuck on a dangerous floor, the 4 of them were on their own. He said they couldn't get out of there on their own. It was too dangerous at these levels, and they needed to return to the staircase immediately and wait for other adventurers nearby. All 4 nodded in agreement, their faces equally tense. There were 2 basic rules in the dungeons, known to every adventurer. Most monsters do not move between floors, and monsters in the dungeon do not attack each other, which meant you could always take cover by the stairs and catch your breath. The group set off back. Eric led the way, followed by the 2 girls, with Thomas bringing up the rear, looking around nervously and clutching his shield and mace tightly in his hands. Eric kept his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead and thought they needed to hurry, because the monsters killed by the group ahead of them would soon begin to gather around the cleared space, and then things would get much worse. When a staircase finally appeared ahead, all four of them couldn't help but break into smiles, for they were almost at their destination, almost safe, just a few more steps. Thomas, at the back, exhaled heavily and lowered his weapon slightly, and at that very moment, a deafening crash rang out. It was followed by a blow of such monstrous force that stone chips flew from the walls and ceiling. All four instinctively ducked. A second later, the silence was shattered by a loud roar. Eric shouted that they had to run upstairs, straight to the 11th floor, but when they reached the stairs, and he looked up, he saw a huge ogre slowly descending right from there. Massive, with fists the size of a human head, covered in gray, bumpy skin, and with the broad, dull grin of a creature that had absolutely no doubt about the outcome of the next few minutes. Eric froze instantly, and a single thought flashed through his mind. They were done for. Hikaru, who had been sitting on a ledge 2 levels above, previously surveying his new underground domain with serenity, flinched at the noise, crouched down, and thought it was unexpectedly noisy here, and then grew alert because the sounds were all too familiar, human. And could it be that some adventurers nearby had gotten into trouble? Behind him, goblins. In front, an ogre. Eric and his team were trapped, and there was no hope that the monsters would kill each other. In the underground labyrinth, they never fought each other. Every adventurer knew that. Suddenly, a roar rang out from behind. Eric spun around and saw 2 goblins emerging from the darkness of the corridor. He immediately drew his sword and rushed to parry the attack, thinking on the fly that they usually fought in pairs, 1 monster for every 2 of them, and if things went the same way, they'd be able to handle it. But out of the corner of his ear, he'd already heard Mary begin casting a spell behind him, and that distracted him slightly. He glanced quickly at his remaining friends and saw that Thomas was cornering 1 goblin, while directly across from him stood a goblin in a robe, muttering something in his own language. And then it hit him. Eric shouted loudly to Thomas to watch out. Magic was coming their way, and Thomas instantly raised his shield and shielded Helena with his body. Both of them screamed loudly from the impact and were sent flying into the wall, hitting it hard. Thomas remained lying on the floor, while Helena struggled to her feet and tried to take a few steps to the side, clutching her injured arm. Eric rushed to his partner and shouted her name loudly. And with that shout, he drew the attention of the ogre, who until that moment had been loitering by the stairs. The ogre froze for a second, shifting his gaze from one to the other. And that second was exactly enough for Eric to realize he had made a mistake. A massive club flew around the corner and crashed into him with all its weight. At the last moment, he managed to raise his sword and block the blow. But the force was such that he was thrown several meters backward, hitting the wall several times before sliding down it to the floor. He coughed, spitting up blood. He lay there, breathing heavily, and he thought that they shouldn't have ventured onto a floor that was beyond their capabilities. This was the price they paid for picking up someone else's loot. Then he struggled to lift his gaze and looked at his teammates. Thomas and Mary were sitting off to the side, Mary trying to cast healing magic on her wounded comrade, while Helena stood a little farther away, fighting off the remaining goblins with her last ounce of strength, though it was clear her mana was nearly depleted. Eric lowered his eyes heavily and began muttering words of apology. They had broken their very first oath. At that moment, a beetle flew into the room. Hikaru looked around carefully and recognized them immediately. Eric and his group. Even if it was a one-sided friendship, he considered them his own, and he couldn't stand by and watch them die without intervening, though he really didn't want to show himself. For a few moments he froze in place, hesitating and thinking he shouldn't get involved, that it wasn't his business. But the next second the ogre swung again at the fallen Eric, and everything was decided, all on its own. He apologized aloud for interfering and went for it. He used a stone needle, summoning several sharp shards and firing them into the ogre's back. The ogre roared loudly in pain and turned around, trying to figure out where the attacks were coming from. While the ogre looked around, Hikaru remained unnoticed and continued his work. A glowing arrow pierced through the goblins one after another, until one of them, the one in the robe, began to cast a spell. Hikaru instantly recognized the nature of the spell and, in a panic, thought it was a fireball. And in the next second, before it could finish, he swung his horn and cast a spell, piercing the goblin through before it could release its magic. The rest roared loudly during the last seconds of their lives and fell silent. Suddenly, an ogre loomed before Hikaru, huge, enraged, clearly having decided that the beetle was the source of all his troubles. He swung his massive club wide and brought it down from above. Hikaru watched the flying weapon and thought that the monster clearly considered him easy prey, and he cast the hardening spell. The club simply crumbled into splinters, as if it were made of rotten wood. Silence hung in the air. The ogre stared blankly at what was left in his hands, turned the fragment over, and asked in his own language, "What's going on? with genuine bewilderment on his rough face. Before it could recover, Hikaru took a few quick steps in a circle and cast a water arrow. It passed right through him, and the ogre slowly, almost solemnly, collapsed to the floor, no longer moving. Eric lay on his back, struggling to see through the blood covering his eyes, and thought that this couldn't be happening. Earth, light, and water, 3 elements at once. Mages who could wield even 2 of these could be counted on one hand worldwide. And all of this was done by just some bug. Helena sat on her knees, staring blankly ahead, her lips moving silently. She simply couldn't find the words. Mary, standing slightly behind her, clasped her hands in a prayerful gesture and continued to cast healing magic on Thomas without looking up. Hikaru flew over to the girls and twitched his mustache, and presented a bundle of medicinal herbs. Helena stared at it in admiration, stumbled over her words, and said that it was medicinal herbs. She took it in her hands and was silent for a long time, then quietly muttered, "What on earth happened?" A little later, a second group of adventurers entered the room, the very same group they had been following at the beginning. After hearing the whole story, one of them, a guy in knight's armor with a tired yet composed expression, interrupted the conversation and simply said that he understood what had happened. Standing next to him was an elven girl, silent but watching everything intently. The knight continued, saying he would escort the younger adventurers to the exit, but that they must never even think of following high-ranking groups again. Eric sighed heavily, swallowed, and muttered that he agreed. Though to himself he thought it was good that they'd managed to join a C-rank group at all. The knight added that the junior adventurers could feel free to butcher any monsters his squad killed along the way for materials. Eric jerked his head up, clearly not expecting that, and, stumbling over his words, thanked the seniors, thinking that they turned out to be far better than he'd expected and that it was a shame to take advantage of them. When they were alone, Eric looked at his men and said that once they got out of here, they needed to become real adventurers and help people like that beetle. All 3 exchanged silent glances and nodded in agreement. Helena remembered the beetle and said that no one would believe them anyway. Thomas, who was already able to stand on his own 2 feet, smiled wryly and added that it was better not to tell anyone. Otherwise, their savior would be declared fair game. Mary, standing slightly behind them, clearly overwhelmed with emotion, said she was certain. It was a messenger of the gods. After all, even in the village of Myra, they had said that some kind of beetle had saved the children. Eric and Helena exchanged a quick glance, and almost simultaneously, with growing panic in their voices, asked each other, could it really be the one? The 10th floor of the Labyrinth of Beginnings. Hikaru thought he had finally managed to evolve. Now he was a Thunder Beetle, rank C, level 1, specializing in basic attributes. And among his new skills were Lightning Shield and Lightning Resistance. He froze thoughtfully in place, thinking that Lightning Shield sounded cool but was too loud. He needed to suppress the magic overflowing from within his body, because otherwise he'd be heard several corridors away, and there'd be no question of stealth. In his mind, he literally flipped a switch on his back, cutting off the energy supply, and exclaimed to himself with genuine surprise that this energy, it turned out, could be turned off at will, which in itself was a very useful discovery. Waving his paws and examining himself, he thought that he was still too bright. He had turned from silver to gold, and living quietly and unnoticed would now be much harder than before. A steady golden glow literally emanated from his body. The 15th floor. Hikaru descended even further and cast the Shining Rain spell. A wave of blinding light swept through the corridor, incinerating the surrounding monsters one by one, quickly and almost effortlessly. After that, he rose high into the air and flapped his wings, thinking that now he could use 3rd-rank light magic thanks to his leveling up, but the problem was that he had become too strong. The monsters scattered in panic the moment they sensed his magic nearby, and the effectiveness of his leveling had dropped to almost 0. He fell into thought, hovering under the ceiling and looking down at the empty corridor below. Maybe he should go upstairs and gather information about new places? After climbing to the surface and settling on one of the rooftops, he began listening to the conversations around him, trying to stay in the shadows and not draw attention. 2 men stood before him, a tall, dark-skinned guy with broad shoulders and a short man in a beret, carrying a staff, clearly the more cautious of the 2. The one with the staff said that people were talking about a monster appearing in the labyrinth, one capable of moving between floors. The tall one added that there were rumors the monsters were even fighting each other, and yet this was a dungeon for beginners, and no one really understood what was going on there at all. Hikaru listened to this and lost control of his magic. His body began to be covered once again with flashes of lightning crackling in the air, and he noted to himself that it all sounded rather unsettling. The dark-skinned adventurer folded his arms across his chest and, with a broad grin, suggested to his partner that they change their hunting grounds to the Gates of Heaven location, a 1 in 1,000 shot. but one where they could hit the jackpot. The man with the staff replied that the mortality rate there was far higher than expected, and he wouldn't go there for anything. And then he added that the journey would take at least 2 weeks, first to the royal capital, and then even further west. Hikaru listened carefully to all this and nodded resolutely to himself. And he flapped his wings. He could reach it on his own in 2 days, and that changed everything. A couple of days later, he was flying over a vast city, stretching out in every direction below him, and he realized that this must be the capital of the kingdom of Veldarin. Someday he would like to live there and take a proper look around, but right now he has no business in the capital. He needed to hurry further west, toward the gates of heaven. Flying over a small town, located right next to the dungeon he was looking for, he landed briefly on a rooftop and noted that it was quite crowded here. It seemed that towns near large dungeons always thrived, attracting adventurers, merchants, and anyone looking to profit off of them. He slipped through the gates of heaven at just the right moment. When the guards were distracted by their drinks, he mentally noted that he was incredibly lucky. Moving along the arches of the high ceiling and looking around carefully, he thought that every dungeon had its own unique atmosphere. Here, the ceiling soared upward. The walls were ochre-colored with reddish streaks, and his golden armor, fortunately, blended well with this hue, providing quite decent camouflage. The dungeon was noticeably larger and more intricate than the Knuckle Labyrinth. Hikaru decided to move slowly and cautiously. On the 17th floor, a huge golem came out to meet him, rank B, level 50. He crouched on one of the ledges and looked thoughtfully at the monster, thinking that a worthy opponent had finally appeared. He needed to see what it was actually capable of. He swung his horn and, without further ado, fired a water arrow, aiming for the vulnerable spots on the lower part of the golem's body, where the stones were joined together and left gaps. The arrow passed right through with a wet crunch. The golem staggered, sank heavily to its knees, and collapsed to the floor with a crash that made the walls tremble, never moving again. Hikaru lifted his head in surprise, and thought that this couldn't be possible. It could be rank monster taken down with a single blow. Since that's the case, let's move on while we've got the momentum. The next serious enemy turned out to be a cockatrice, half rooster, half snake, with large leathery wings and a long scaly tail that dragged across the stone floor with a soft rustle, leaving a trail of damp dust in its wake. Rank B+, level 53, ability, magic gaze, petrification. Hikaru easily dropped to the ground a short distance away and snorted, magic gaze, plus petrification. That could be a serious problem, especially if it manages to lock eyes with him before he can react. The cockatrice's head had already begun to slowly scan its surroundings, turning from side to side with mechanical slowness, clearly searching for prey. Hikaru didn't wait. He cast a water bullet, creating several dense streams of water that rose between him and a monster like a living curtain, blocking the cockatrice's direct line of sight. And immediately afterward, he fired an air cutter, sending an invisible blade straight into the enemy's side. The creature flinched and let out a deafening roar, whirling toward the source of the pain and beginning to lash its tail against the stone floor. While the monster thrashed about, Hikaru redirected the water streams and enveloped the cockatrice's chicken-like head in a dense water bubble, completely blocking its vision. If its eyes are covered by water, protection against the magical gaze is complete and the monster is blind, and all that remained was to strike a vital organ before it could shake off the water. Without a moment's hesitation, he fired a glowing arrow and pierced the heart right through. The cockatrice twitched one last time, its tail lashed forcefully against the floor, and it froze. Hikaru soared on his wings, and realized that the sound of the battle had attracted a new opponent. This one moved quickly and confidently, clearly accustomed to these corridors. Hikaru used his detection skill and instantly spotted the approaching Drake, rank B, level 48, with a fire breath ability. Hikaru quickly assessed the situation. There were walls and a ceiling all around, so if the Drake used its breath in this enclosed space, it would instantly turn into an oven, and there wouldn't be much room to dodge. Without giving it time to take a breath, he immediately fired a water bullet. It struck the open maw before the Drake could form a stream of fire, nipping the attack in the bud. And then he unleashed several water blades in quick succession. They sliced through the scaly neck one after another. The Drake fell onto its side with a hoarse, choking roar, no longer moving, and the corridor fell silent once more. Hikaru grunted. He descended and flew closer to the body, thinking he wanted to finish it off by hand. But it turned out that even at the gates of heaven, he was effortlessly dispatching every monster in a row, not even having time to really get into the swing of the fight. If he went even deeper, perhaps he'd finally have a chance to reach rank A and find opponents who would make him think, rather than just react. And then it hit him. He caught himself thinking that he'd become genuinely curious. What was he actually capable of at full strength right now? and he couldn't help but wonder if back then in the mountains he had to face that red dragon named Vola again. Would he be able to do anything this time? The 21st floor of the Gates of Heaven. The new enemy turned out to be a basilisk. Rank A, level 66, with special abilities, heat sensitivity, and a petrifying gaze. The monster looked like a giant cobra with dull green scales that shimmered with an oily sheen in the dim light. It crawled silently across the stone floor, wriggling its muscular body. Hikaru sat on the wall, his claws clinging to the rough stone. This creature was nowhere near the red dragon, but it was still a serious opponent. He planned to block its heat detection ability with a water barrier that would conceal his body temperature. But first, he had to disable its magical gaze. The next second, Hikaru fired a glowing arrow. The projectile pierced the darkness, and it hit its mark, piercing both of the basilisk's eyes at once. The monster roared so loudly that stone dust rained down from the ceiling, and it shook its head wildly. Hikaru watched intently, and almost immediately realized that the monster had pinpointed his location anyway. After all, the serpent's abilities included regeneration. He had to finish it off without wasting a second. He used the air cutter, but the snake managed to coil itself into a tight spiral, blocking access to its vulnerable spots. Then there was only one option left, to finish off the basilisk with a blow to the forehead. Hikaru closed the distance and used the thunder spear. Lightning struck the monster with a deafening crack, sending bolts of electricity coursing through the body, causing its scales to bristle and char. The basilisk twitched one last time and went still. Hikaru mentally shouted that this was a victory. The monster's scorched body lay on the floor, charred black in places, and twitched slightly from residual impulses. Lightning was a useful element. It was worth leveling up alongside water magic. As he flew further down the corridors, he reflected that no one had ever made it past the 3rd floor in this dungeon. They said that monsters of rank A and higher began on the 30th floor. But at his level, he shouldn't stop. He was determined. His goal now was the 30th floor. On the 28th floor, he encountered a phantom tiger. Rank A+, level 84. The monster stood in the middle of the corridor, its enormous yellow eyes slowly scanning the space. Hikaru hovered a few meters above the floor. This tiger was clearly more than just an A+. The power emanating from its muscular body was almost palpable. Then he froze, realizing that the enemy was already too close. How had such a huge cat managed to sneak up on him unnoticed? In the next second, the tiger began to dissolve before his eyes. Its fur turned pale, blending into the stone. Hikaru screamed inwardly and immediately unleashed the thunder spear, hoping to interrupt the ability. But the predator leaped back sharply. The tiger took several swift steps toward Hikaru. A massive paw swung down to strike. Hikaru used his hardening skill. He flapped his wings and barely made it out of the way. The claws whistled past him by mere centimeters. He flew backward and realized it was now his turn. Hikaru used Shining Rain. A cascade of light arrows rained down on the corridor. The tiger roared loudly and formed a black dome around itself, absorbing the light. Hikaru gasped. The monster knew not only how to attack, but also how to defend itself. All that was left to do was to bombard it with a barrage of spells. One after another, the shining arrows slammed into the black veil, thinning it. At one point, one of them pierced the darkness and struck the tiger's paw. The monster's movements began to slow. Hikaru thought with relief that it would collapse any moment now. But suddenly, everything around him went pitch black. He couldn't see a thing, not even his own paws. 3rd level dark magic, dark mist. It was impossible to fly normally inside it. It felt as if his wings had been dipped in tar. Hikaru thought it might be a status effect. The next second, a huge tiger's muzzle appeared right in front of him. Its yellow eyes burned like hellfire. The paw struck with all its might. Hikaru slammed hard into the wall. He gasped for breath. Something cracked inside him, but resisting the pain allowed him to keep his mind clear. He cast a 2nd level water spell. A whirlpool. Water began to gather around the tiger, swirling at breakneck speed. He couldn't give the monster a single second to cast another spell. The tiger tried to break free, lashing at the water with its paws, trying to leap out, but the whirlpool pulled it back in. Finally, it let out a pitiful meow and went under the water, head first. After a while, Hikaru released the water. The tiger lay lifeless on the floor, its wet striped fur glistening in the dim light. Hikaru watched and thought. Even though this was a victory, it seemed to be his limit. It was time to retreat for now, but suddenly it dawned on him. He could evolve now. He glanced at the card in front of him, and when he read what was written there, he cried out in inner panic. What on earth is this? The hidden king Miasis. Hikaru evolved and returned to his safe place. He used his assessment and saw 2 cards in front of him with possible evolution options. Adelobacillus, the ancestor of mice, and Miasis, the ancestor of dogs and cats. Looking at the choices, he chuckled and noted to himself that he had finally moved on to the order of mammals. And since in the last battle he had faced a huge cat, a phantom tiger, the choice was, of course, obvious. In the next second, the rhinoceros beetle was enveloped in a bright light, warm, golden, penetrating through the shell and reshaping the body from within. When the glow faded, a small cat stood on the ground. Now he was Miasis, a feline type, rank D, level 1. After a while, the protagonist approached the nearest puddle and stared intently at his reflection. He snorted. He didn't look very cute. All black, with smooth, short fur that barely reflected light, and eyes that glowed with a yellowish hue in the darkness. He clearly looked like a monster, not a pet. Then Hikaru raised his head high and spotted the pale disk of the sun through the treetops. He thought that going back down in the maze now wouldn't be easy. So, for starters, he should explore the Sula forest. A little later, the sky clouded over, and it began to rain. Large, cold raindrops drummed against his back, causing his fur to clump together and grow heavy. So the protagonist decided to go in search of shelter. He found a cave fairly quickly. Suddenly, a woman's voice caught his attention. Hikaru exclaimed to himself in surprise, "What is a human doing here?" The girl, noticing a dark silhouette at the entrance, wondered if it could be a cat, or maybe not a cat. She couldn't see well in the dark, but she sensed movement. Or perhaps it was a monster that had come to finish her off. The protagonist snapped to attention and took a few steps back, bristling warily. He thought, where did this person come from, and why didn't his detection work? Perhaps the girl had some special constitution or skill that concealed her presence. The girl, noticing the dark cat's agitation, chuckled softly and muttered, breathing heavily, that this beast was unlikely to understand any human words at all. Then she leaned toward the animal with a small, almost fading smile, and asked if he could kill her. After all, she's a spy for the Empire. Hikaru froze. The girl named Emilia, as it turned out, had come to this kingdom from another continent on a mission from the Empire to gather intelligence. But she had made a mistake unforgivable for a spy. She had fallen in love with the prince of this kingdom, and had even become pregnant by him. She couldn't betray the Empire, but she couldn't return to the Empire and leave her child behind either. In such a situation, she obviously could not raise the child she had given birth to. So immediately after the birth, her daughter was sent to an orphanage, and that was the end of it. For the next 4 years, Emilia deceived the Empire by feeding it this trivial information. But just recently, her double-crossing was finally exposed. Now she has nowhere to return to. She was wounded while fleeing the castle. Finishing her quiet monologue, the girl looked at the frozen animal beside her and said with a small smile that now he could see what kind of situation she was in. So, if he ever felt like killing someone defenseless, it wouldn't be a bad idea if the monster finished her off. The protagonist twitched his ears slightly, looking confused and alarmed. He wondered, what should he do now? After a while, the girl lost consciousness. Hikaru thought he should feed her first. In his inventory, there was a horned rabbit he'd caught back in the maze, and some fruit he'd picked to try. But that might not be enough. He needed to get some fresh food. Besides, since the rain had stopped, he could level up at the same time, find a monster, take it down, and get both meat and experience. True, monsters hadn't been showing up often in this part of the forest lately. For a while, the protagonist hopped from branch to branch, moving silently through the wet foliage. Suddenly, a rustle from the side caught his attention. It was a rainbow turkey. Hikaru's eyes lit up. So that's it, he'd finally found it. The next second, he leaped from the branch right onto the turkey and sank his fangs into its neck. The bird let out a loud cry. The protagonist thought to himself that this bird was bigger than he'd expected. Besides, if this kept up, he'd simply get dizzy and lose his bearings. He needed to deliver the decisive blow. The next second, Hikaru leaped to the side, summoned his air blade, and with a single precise strike, severed the bird's head. The turkey's body collapsed to the ground, twitched a few times, and went still. Then Hikaru hung the carcass upside down from the nearest branch, mentally noting that this would also let the blood drain out. After a while, he returned to the cave. He mentally apologized for intruding, and then something made him wary. Emilia's vital signs had grown even weaker than before he'd left. The next second, he sprang to his feet, unable to believe what he was sensing. The girl was lying on the floor, unable to move. Her body was drenched in sweat, her skin burning. She had clearly developed a high fever. The protagonist approached the girl and saw that her ankle was injured. The skin around it had turned a purplish blue. An infection? Or no, it was poison. In any case, he had to do what he could. To start with, he decided to suck out the poison. He pressed his mouth against the wound and began carefully drawing out the dark, foul-smelling liquid, spitting it onto the floor. Then he needed to give the girl some medicinal herbs to eat and apply the remaining leaves to the wound. Emilia also needed to drink at least a little fruit juice to replenish her nutrients. Having done everything in his power, the protagonist curled up in a ball next to Emilia's hand and fell asleep. After a while, Emilia came to. She sat up abruptly, ran a hand over her face, and muttered hoarsely and in surprise, "So, does that mean she didn't die after all? Could this little kitten really have healed her?" Looking at her leg, the girl saw that it was wrapped in makeshift bandages made of some kind of leaves and looked much healthier. The swelling had gone down, and her skin color had almost returned to normal. Emilia sighed and said she vaguely remembered a small monster fussing over her, bringing things in its mouth, warming her with its breath. Could it really be a high-level monster? After all, it was obvious that it had a high intelligence. But why did the monster save her? The next second, she pulled her hand away, feeling slightly embarrassed, and asked herself, could it be a summoned monster? After a while, the roasted horned rabbit was ready, which Emilia had cooked over a small fire at the cave entrance. The protagonist immediately dove into the meal. When asked if it tasted good, he wagged his tail. After all, roasted meat is the best thing in the world. The girl, looking at him, muttered that she had been planning to die here, but since there was someone, even if it was a monster, willing to help her survive, perhaps she should try a little harder. She decided to return to the Empire, confess to double espionage, and try to negotiate so that she would be allowed to live in this kingdom. Watching the cat lick its lips contentedly, the girl's eyes sparkled, and she continued, "It was all thanks to him." Then she waved goodbye and left the cave. Meanwhile, after parting ways with Emilia, the protagonist continued leveling up in the Sula forest. He was hunting small monsters. A few days later, after dispatching yet another opponent, he suddenly realized he had reached a level where he could evolve. A menu appeared before him with 5 options: Killer Dog, Killer Cat, Killer Fox, Warhorse, and Fanged Wolf. And once again, all the options were animal-type monsters. Hikaru thought it over. If he chose wisely, he might be able to make it to the royal capital. Hikaru decided to ponder his choice. He wanted to turn into an animal that wouldn't arouse suspicion, even if he entered the city. Wolves and foxes aren't liked, and if he became a horse, he would most likely scare everyone. That left either the killer dog or the killer cat. And in this situation, he naturally chose the freedom-loving cat. A glow enveloped his body, and in an instant, he transformed into 8D rank tabby cat. He opened his mouth and noticed that his fangs were a bit too long, which was a minor drawback. But his base stats had increased significantly, and he was most likely stronger now than he had been in his previous form as a thunder beetle. Hikaru studied mana magic and 4th rank spatial magic. He also acquired acceleration, a spell that boosts magical power within a certain radius, and deceleration, a spell that slows down time within a certain radius, much like Faceless Void from Dota 2. It seemed incredibly powerful to him, and he decided to go level up immediately. The 20th floor of the Corridor of the Heavens. He immediately took down one of his opponents and exclaimed that this was great, since there were many monsters on this floor at his level that he could defeat. After a while, his level had reached 30, and he decided to head to the surface. After all, the rumbling in his stomach was already distracting him from hunting. Upon exiting the dungeon, he caught the eye of a guard, who wondered whose cat was wandering the streets. Hikaru decided to hunt for food, and the thought of heading to the capital crossed his mind. The garrison soldiers chased him away, and he jumped into a cart, and he slipped unnoticed into the city. Peering out from the cart, he was surprised by the sight of the capital. There were many people walking the streets. After all, goods from all over the land converged on this very place. The smells mingled together, and he wondered if he could somehow get his hands on some food. He could easily find something in the trash, but he didn't want to settle for that. Then one of the passers-by noticed him and assumed the cat was homeless. This person turned out to be a man, an employee of one of the local establishments. He glanced at the cat and said he'd never seen him in this neighborhood before. Hikaru cursed under his breath and thought again that he needed to be more careful. After all, you shouldn't underestimate the locals, who are capable of anything. But he tried to please the man and meowed. The man laughed and realized the animal was hungry, so he offered him some work meat. Hikaru was pleased with the offering and noticed that the meat tasted wonderful. He thought the man was very kind. Suddenly, the boss approached the man and asked why he was giving meat meant for sale to a stray cat. The man quickly apologized. Then he crouched down and said that the protagonist could come anytime he got hungry. Hikaru licked his lips with satisfaction, and after some time, he came to the capital's city wall, observing the city and reflecting on the fact that this man had sacrificed meat from his sales to feed him, and he felt that such a person simply had to be thanked. One option was to buy something at the market, but to do that, he'd have to trade the monster materials for money, and he didn't know how to do that on his own. He turned around and asked the stray animals living in the city what he should do. They told him that people exchange materials for money at the guild, and Hikaru headed there. He learned that there was a crafts district in the western part of the city, home to various guilds, including the Merchants Guild and the Adventurers Guild. But the most active of these was the Adventurers Guild. He went inside and overheard a conversation between two adventurers standing next to the bulletin board. One of them said that one of the quests mentioned a girl who had been kidnapped by orcs, and he really hoped they would help her. Hikaru, who was watching them, was glad that his first skill had been understanding the local language. But even if he found the wallet, they wouldn't give him the money. So he decided to go on the quest involving the orcs. But before that, he decided to assess the adventurers present. One of them was a human named Gerald, rank B, level 42. The second was an elf named Nia, rank B, level 46. Hikaru grumbled to himself. He had chosen the strongest ones present, in his opinion, but even they turned out to be B rank. And there was simply no adventurers superior to these two. He surmised that rank adventurers were simply a rarity. After a while, he took down another horned rabbit. This was already the 10th one. But even if he sold the materials from this one to the guild, the proceeds would be small, and there were still no orcs in sight. And he really wanted to provide that kind man with meat. So he decided to head south of the capital toward the city of Galgandia in the afternoon. On the way, he hunted horned rabbits again. He snacked on river fish, and he even spotted a couple of apples. But rank goblins caught his attention. A whole pack, in fact, but even in such numbers, they were no match for him. He used his air cutter and destroyed all the monsters. Climbing a tree, he looked around and realized that the forest was quite dense, but the orcs must be somewhere nearby. He recalled that rumors were beginning to spread in the Adventurers Guild that orcs were kidnapping women and having children with them. Therefore, an unspoken law had emerged in this world. Anyone who encountered an orc was obligated to fight it to the death. But this rule did not apply to the protagonist. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps caught his attention. He glanced to the side and saw an orc passing by. He surmised that they were up to something, and that one of them was presumably heading toward the settlement. He decided to follow. After a while, following the tracks, a small settlement came into view. Hikaru growled and thought that this was exactly what he'd expected, and he was already getting ready to give the orcs a good thrashing. But suddenly, one of the monsters laughed heartily and patted him on the head. Hikaru realized they had simply taken him for a cute cat, but his mind kept racing about this settlement. He couldn't have imagined it was so close to the capital, and the human's combat abilities turned out to be far weaker than he'd expected. So he decided to begin exterminating the orcs. The protagonist summoned a shower of light. The orc who had been petting him just moments ago looked up at the sky in surprise and muttered something in his own language. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.